Mahelwari settlement. The village community, which some of the early Western observers from Charles Metcalfe to Henry Manet spoke so eloquently about, figured neither in the permanent settlement nor in the Ryotwari system. However, when these two systems were being worked out, vast stretches of territory in north and northwestern India were open. Between 1801 and 1806. This region, once the heartland of the Mughal Empire, stretching from the Himalayan foothills to the central Indian plateau, including the Ganga-Jamna Doab, formed the northwestern provinces. In the agrarian structure of this area, there was on the one hand, a small group of magnates, known as the Tluktars. Nurul Hasan has described them as the intermediary zamindars, who contracted with the state to realize the revenue of a given territory. There were on the other hand, a large group of primary zamindars, who were the holders of proprietary rights over agricultural as well as habitational lands. Included in this group were both the small owner cultivators and also the large proprietors of several villages. And with the Bengal model in mind, the British initially proceeded to collect revenue from the Tluktars, who by the end of the 18th century included two distinct social groups. On the one hand there were the locally entrenched, rulers of the lineage-dominated principalities, and on the other, the Mughal Jagirdars, revenue officials and tax farmers who had instituted themselves as de facto Rajas or Tluktars. 78 These initial short-term settlements, eventually to be made permanent, were based on artificial and faulty estimates of the productivity of the newly conquered lands, and therefore revenue assessments in many cases were abnormally high. Many of the big Tluktars resisted the new regime and its high revenue demand, and were liquidated with utter ruthlessness. Many were driven off and their mud fortresses razed to the ground. In other cases, defaulting estates were sold off by the government. As a result, by 1820, many of this inchoate magnate class of Upper India, as Eric Stokes described them, had either lost their position entirely or were left in a shrunken condition. The land sold in auction was often bought by the amlas and tahsildars, who used their local knowledge and manipulated their power to buy some of the best properties in the area. In the Banaras region, for example, about 40% of land had changed hands by the middle of the 19th century and they went into the possession of, as Bernard Cohn gives the list, under the civil servants and their descendants, and to merchants and bankers. These people came to constitute a new class of landlords, who were outsiders to the village community and had different attitudes to the land. But on the other hand, as Thomas Metcalfe has argued, since land market was imperfect, often there were no buyers, and frequently the new purchasers had to leave the former owners in charge. In few cases only the land actually changed hands. The situation created nevertheless a scare that land was passing into the hands of non-cultivating classes. Holt Mackenzie in 1819 describing it as a melancholy revolution, for in his judgment only the village coparcenary bodies were the sole owners of the land. 81 So from Tluktars British preference now shifted to the primary zamindars and village communities. Mackenzie's recommendations were incorporated in the Regulation 7 of 1822, which provided for a detailed field-to-field survey for revenue assessment. Settlement was to be made with the village community or with the Tluktar where available, and in addition to the rights of the proprietors, the rent to be paid by the resident cultivating peasants was also to be ascertained and recorded. Thus Tluktars were not completely eliminated, but where possible joint proprietary right in land was vested in the village communities. The refractory and oppressive nature of the tluktars and the need to maximize revenue as well as protect the rights of the peasant proprietors to ensure the improvement of agriculture, rather than the influence of the Ricardian theory of rent, prompted the making of the Mahelwari settlement. But the new settlement from the very beginning was enmeshed in confusion and corruption, as in practice it was virtually impossible to implement. The survey, which was at the core of the new arrangement, failed, because it was too complex to be carried out with the existing administrative machinery. The obvious result was overassessment, based on idiosyncratic estimates. 82. The situation was worsened by the agricultural depression of 1828. Arrears started mounting, land remained uncultivated, buyers were difficult to find. Some reforms had become clearly necessary, which came in the Regulation 11 of 1833. The revised system, as worked out by another civilian, R.M. Budd, provided for a detailed survey to assess the revenue of an entire mahale or fiscal unit, based on the net value of potential produce of the field. The total revenue thus fixed was then to be shared by the members of a co-sharing body. The state was to appropriate 2/3 of the net income of the land and the settlement was to be made for 30 years. But the village settlements, started by Budd and completed by James Thomason, were again based on imperfect survey, inaccurate calculations and therefore overassessment. And they were marked by an unconcealed hostility towards the tluktars, whom Budd considered to be a host of unproductives. Many of them were dispossessed and pensioned off with a cash allowance, and so effective was this policy that it nearly flattened the whole surface of society, as the lieutenant governor of the province commented in 1842 after Budd's rearrangement. Of a golden age for the village communities, which were ruined by high revenue demand, mounting debt burden, arrears of revenue and the resulting sales of their properties and dispossession through decrees of the civil courts. Land in many cases passed into the hands of moneylenders and merchants, more so in the commercialized districts. Whether this meant a fundamental social upheaval is open to question, as in many cases the formal sale of properties did not effect any real change in the structure of landholding in the villages, as the new purchasers could hardly do anything without the original owners. But, as Thomas Metcalfe concedes, one can hardly say that nothing happened. 8. The grievances of the rural society of North India were soon to be expressed rather loudly and violently in the revolt of 1857, as we shall see in the next chapter. Thus by the middle of the 19th century the company's administration had devised 3 systems of land revenue administration, creating private property in land and conferring that proprietary right on 3 different groups. The permanent settlement was made with the Zamindars, the Rayovadi settlement with the ryots or peasant proprietors and the Mahelwari settlement with the village community. The latter system was extended to Punjab and central India when those regions were conquered subsequently, while the Rayotwari system was introduced in Sindh, Assam and Coorg. The Zamindari system was tried in the northern districts of the Madras Presidency where Zamindars could be found. According to a rough estimate, in 1928 to 1929 about 19% of the cultivable land in India was under Zamindari settlement, 29% under Mahelwari settlement and 52% under Rayotwari system. A common feature of all the settlements, as we have noted, was overassessment, as the primary aim of the company's government was to maximize revenue income. The results were arrears of payment, mounting debt, increasing land sales and dispossession. Contrary to received wisdom, modern research has established that the effects of these changes were less spectacular than once imagined, and had significant regional variations, as the land transfers could not fundamentally alter the structure of landholding everywhere. The agrarian society thus proved to be more resilient than once thought to be. But the groups and classes that survived had substantially different rights, obligations and powers. These changes and grievances generating from there were amply reflected in the series of agrarian disturbances that marked the first century of British rule in India, which we shall examine in the next chapter. As the empire grew in size and its resources needed to be controlled, so did the need for an efficient and authoritative administrative system increase. Initially there was respect for Indian tradition and no attempts were made to impose European ideals. But soon this mid-18th century construction of a rational Asia began to wane, as the conquerors felt the need to assert sovereignty and exert control to ensure a steady flow of revenue. The idea of cultural particularism gradually began to lose ground in the face of evangelical attacks and the utilitarian zeal for reform. The idea of improvement led to the introduction of British principles of justice and uniformity under a civil authority exercised by British personnel. Good laws and sound administration, it was hoped, would lead to the freeing of individual initiative from despotism, irrational customs and traditions. This would give free and full scope for capital and labor and place due emphasis on individual rights and ownership. The utilitarians advocated the rule of law for India, while a uniform system of administration throughout the conquered territories also suited British interests. Till 1813 the company acted more like a traditional Indian ruler, avoiding innovation or intervention, but keeping nonetheless a vigilant eye on extracting agricultural surplus. But this scenario gradually changed under the ideological pressure of the intellectual movements mentioned above and also because the Industrial Revolution in Britain necessitated an integration of the markets throughout India and her development as a source for agricultural raw materials. All this required an unequivocal assertion of sovereignty, much greater penetration into Indian economy and society and control over Indian trade not only with Britain but with other countries as well. Judicial system. The grant of Diwani in 1765 gave the East India Company the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, but the Nawabi administration and the Mughal system remained in place. The practical implications of this dual administration were however very little, as the authority of the Nawab was overtly and systematically undermined by the company, while maintaining for some time to come the fiction of Mughal sovereignty. The judicial administration of the Subah remained initially in the hands of the Indian officers between 1765 and 1772 and the Mughal system was followed in both civil and criminal justice. Clive appointed Muhammad Rida Khan to represent the company's civil jurisdiction. As Naib Nazim, he also administered the criminal jurisdiction of the Nawab. However, this acceptance of the indigenous system depended to a large extent on the colonizers' understanding and interpretation of it. The Mughal system was never centrally organized and depended to a large extent on the local Faujdars and their executive discretion. Although the Sharia or the Islamic law was referred to for legitimation, its application varied widely depending on the seriousness of the case and the interpretation of muftis and qajis. The focus of this system was more on mutual resolution of conflict rather than punitive justice, except in cases of rebellion, and punishment when meted out often depended on the status of the accused. To many company officials this system looked like one marked by unusual laxity and they attributed it to an 18th century degeneration when the zamindars and revenue farmers had allegedly usurped judicial authority. These people were thought to be driven more by considerations for pecuniary benefit than justice and this led to the complaint about the venality of the justice system. It was therefore argued by I-769 that there was need for some sort of direct or overt European supervision to ensure a centralization of the judicial prerogative, retrieved from the hands of the zamindars and revenue farmers, and thereby to assert companies' sovereignty. 86 So when Warren Hastings took charge as governor in I-772, he decided to take full control of the justice system and he had no doubts whatsoever as to why he should. Through such a measure, he reasoned, the people of this country would be accustomed to the company's sovereignty. 87 One major reason for arresting Rida Khan in 1772 and for keeping him in confinement without trial for nearly 2 years was to get rid of the most powerful obstacle to this project of eliminating Indian agents from the administration of justice. It was Khan who was continually insisting on Mughal sovereignty and the supremacy of Islamic laws. Even after his acquittal, Hastings pleaded with the company directors not to restore him to his former position. 88 Under the new system of 1772, each district was to have 2 courts, a civil court or Diwan-i Adalak and a criminal court or Aujari Adalak. Thus the Mughal nomenclature was retained, and the laws to be applicable were Muslim laws in criminal justice and the Muslim or Hindu laws in adjudicating personal matters, such as inheritance, marriage etc. This division of the topics of law was evidently in accordance with the English system, which left such matters as marriage, divorce, property, religious worship or excommunication, in the jurisdiction of the bishops' courts, where the law applicable The ecclesiastical law. 89 The civil courts in India were to be presided over by the European district collectors, and they were to be assisted by Maulvis and Brahman Pandits interpreting indigenous laws for their understanding. There would be an appeal court in Calcutta, which too would be presided over by the president and 2 members of the council. The criminal courts were to be under a Qaji and a Mufti, but they were to be supervised by the European collectors. The appeal court, the Southern Nizarna Adalak, was removed from Murshidabad to Calcutta. Rida Khan had already been dismissed and now the control of the court was vested in the president and council members. However, the legage fiction of Nawabi sovereignty was still maintained, as all their orders were sent to the Nawab for his final sanction. In reality, Hastings personally supervised the criminal justice system until 1774, when he finally acknowledged his failure to improve law and order situation and reluctantly accepted the Court of Directors' decision to reappoint Rida Khan at the head of the Nijamat Adalak, which was once again moved back to Murshidabad. In civil justice system further changes took place between 1773 and 1781, partly in response to the demands of revenue collection and partly in deference to the Whig principle of separating executive functions from the administration of justice. According to the plans worked out by Hastings and Sir Elijah Impey, the Chief Justice of the Calcutta High Court, district collectors were divested of their judicial duties. In the area of civil justice, instead of district courts, in area JLY 6 provincial courts, later replaced by 18 Mufassil courts, were created and they were to be presided over by only the European covenanted officers of the company, who would be designated judges for this purpose. For some time the new Supreme Court, created by the Regulating Act of 1773, acted as an appeal court, but its conflict with the Supreme Council over definition of jurisdiction led to the confinement of its authority to the city of Calcutta and to matters related to factories dependent on Fort William. In its place the Sadar Diwani Adalak was now reconstituted to serve as an appeal court, with Sir Elijah himself taking over its superintendence. 1780. Along with this Europeanization, which was the most dominant and visible feature of the judicial reforms of this period, there was also another coherent trend, and that was towards systematization or institutionalization of the civil justice system. The Code of 1781 prescribed specific rules and regulations to be followed in all the civil courts down to the lowest level, and all judicial orders were henceforth to be in writing. The major problem that hindered certainty and uniformity in the system was that of conflicting and varying interpretations of indigenous laws, as Brahman Pandits, for example, often gave divergent interpretations of the various schools of Deba Shastra, and sometimes their opinions on the same law varied widely from case to case. To reduce this element of uncertainty, a committee of 11 Pandits compiled, at the behest of Hastings, a digest of Hindu laws in 177.5, and it was translated into English by N.B. Hajhed in 1776 for the purpose of lessening the dependence of European judges on their indigenous interpreters. 91. A Code of Muslim Laws was also compiled by 1778. With this standardization of law, the practice of law now needed professional expertise that could only be expected from a specially trained group of people, the lawyers. Thus, in its effects, the reforms of the Hastings era tended to centralize judicial authority and reduce administration to a system, and there was a certain reversal of this system in 1787, when once again the collector was given the duty of administering civil justice. It was Lord Cornwallis and his Code of 1793 that finally set the rule of separating revenue collection from administration of civil justice as a safeguard for property rights against abuse of power by revenue officials and their agents. The new system provided for a hierarchy of courts from Zilla, district, and city courts to 4 provincial courts and the Sadar Divani Adajat with appellate jurisdiction. All the courts were to be headed by European judges, with provision for appointment of native commissioners. The criminal justice system was also completely overhauled, as the district magistrates complained to Cornwallis about the anomalies of Islamic laws and the corrupt practices at the criminal courts. But more importantly, it was felt that such an important branch of administration could no longer be left in charge of an Indian. 93 The Faujdari Adalats, which until then functioned under Naib Nazim Rida Khan, were therefore abolished and replaced by courts of circuit, headed by European judges. The office of the Naib Nazim itself was abolished and the Sadar Nijamat Adalat was brought back to Calcutta and placed directly under the supervision of the Governor-General in Council. The jurisdiction of these criminal courts did not extend to the British Band subjects, who remained under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court at Calcutta. The entire judicial reform of Cornwallis therefore spoke of one thing: a total exclusion of Indians from the whole system, which became less ambiguous in its authoritarian and racially superior tone. The Cornwallis regulations were extended to the province of Banaras in 1795 and to the ceded and conquered provinces in 1805 respectively. But the Bengal system, based on the assumptions of a permanent settlement with the Zamindars, faltered seriously in Madras, where it was introduced because of Lord Wellesley. By 1906 it was clear that in a Ryotwari area, where the collector had to function also as a settlement officer and assess revenue, and where there was no such powerful class as the Zamindars of Bengal, the separation of revenue collection and magisterial and judicial powers posed serious problems. On Thomas Munro's insistence, the Court of Directors in 1814 therefore proposed a different system for Madras, which included provisions for greater Indianization of the system at the lower levels, village panchayats, district and city courts, and the union of magisterial, revenue collection and some judicial powers in the office of the collector. Fully introduced in Madras by 1816, it was later extended to Bombay by Elphinstone in 1819. Certain unresolved issues remained in the area of judicial administration, however. Apart from the question of Indianization, there was the issue of codification of laws, which would establish a uniform judicial administration and civil authority throughout British India. These issues were not raised until the Governor-Generalship of Lord Bentinck and the Charter Act of 1833. The Act, first of all, threw open judicial positions to Indians and provided for the appointment of a law commission for codification of laws. By this time the collectors had once again resumed magisterial authority and some judicial power. The Law Commission appointed under Lord Macaulay completed the task of codification by 1837, but it had to wait until after the revolt of 1857 for full implementation. The Code of Civil Procedure was introduced in 1859, the Indian Penal Code in 1860 and the Criminal Procedure Code in 1862. The new codes, as Radhika Singha has argued, sought to establish the universal principles of jurisprudence, based on a notion of indivisible sovereignty and its claims over an equal abstract and universal legal subject. But this institutionalized justice system, it needs to be mentioned here, was to be applicable only in British India. In the vast regions that remained within the princely states, whose size and efficiency varied widely, the judicial administration was usually run by a motley amalgam of British Indian laws and personal decrees of the princes, who also acted as the highest judicial appellate authority. But they too were subjected to constant imperious supervision of the British residents and political agents stationed in their court. For more details, see section on residents and paramountcy. 95. In British India, however, the judicial administration now looked significantly different from what it was under the Mughal rule, and these changes the ordinary Indians found hard to comprehend. 96. While previously they had access to a variety of judicial procedures, now they were subjected to a streamlined system. Although initially in personal matters traditional Hindu and Muslim laws were applied, the judicial interpretations made the laws often look very different and incomprehensible to the indigenous people. Justice now became distant, not just physically, because of the geographical distance from the district courts, but also psychologically, as the indigenous people did not understand the complex judicial procedures, dominated by a new class of lawyer. As a result, justice also became expensive. And as the huge number of court cases started piling up, for most people justice became inordinately delayed, sometimes even by 50 years. But there were elements of continuity too, particularly in the first century of British rule. In most cases, the way Hindu personal laws were interpreted by Brahman Pandits that these only benefited the conservative and feudal elements in Indian society. It was only the public side of the law that upheld the idea of freeing the individual from the shackles of status. 97 But here too there were problems, as the colonial system retained a considerable terrain for judicial discretion, based on the argument of cultural particularism or civilizational inferiority of the indigenous people. The concept of equality before law often did not apply to the Europeans. If there was greater movement towards equality in civil justice system, racial privilege for the rulers remained in place in various forms in the criminal courts. 98 And there were significant domains of activity, for example, those of the police and the army, which remained unaffected by this colonial definition of the rule of law. Police. When the East India Company took over Divani in 1765, the Mughal police system was under the control of the Faujdars, who were in charge of their sarkars or rural districts. The Kawals were in charge of the towns, while the village watchmen were paid and controlled by the Zamindars. This system continued for some time under the authority of Muhammad Rida Khan acting as the Naib-e-Azim with his station at Murshidabad. But the old system could hardly function effectively, as the growing power of the company had thoroughly undermined the authority of the Nawab. Crime rates began spiraling upward after the famine of 1770, and the general state of law and order declined day by day with an alarming rise in the rate of crime against property. For the company officials, like https://telegram.me other departments, the police administration too seemed to be in need of European supervision, as every crime was a direct affront to their authority. The forgery system continued with minor modifications until 1781, when the Faujdars were finally replaced by English magistrates. The Zamindars retained their police duties, but were made subservient to the magistrates. But this limited reform of Warren Hastings could not solve the problem, as the establishments of the magistrates proved to be too inadequate for the purpose, while the Zamindars abused the system and freely took advantage of its weaknesses. So Lord Cornwallis in 1793 decided to divest the Zamindars of their policing duties, and instead divided the districts into thanas or units of police jurisdiction of 20 to 30 square miles, each placed under a new officer called Daroga, who was to be appointed and supervised by the magistrates. The Daroga thus became a new instrument of control for the company's government in the Diwane provinces, or as the peasants looked at them, as the local representatives of the aura and authority of the company Bahadur. 99 A new and alien element in the countryside, they could hardly ignore the powerful local landed magnates, who retained much of their extra-legal coercive powers and in most cases made alliances with them. By the 19th century the Daroga-Zamindar nexus thus emerged as a new instrument of coercion and oppression in Bengal rural life. But on the other hand, when the resourceful contestants for power in the countryside, the Zamindars and the planters, both having posses of mercenaries or Laratiyals at their command, got embroiled in fierce battles for territories, the ill-equipped and poorly provided Darogas stood as helpless onlookers. 100 Therefore, when the regulation was extended to Banaras in 1795, Jonathan Duncan, the resident at Banaras, made further modifications to make the Tahsildars, who were to be in charge of the policing units, more subservient to the magistrates and the Zamindars more responsible for crime prevention in their estates. The Daroga system was extended to Madras in 1802 and the Tahsildari system to the ceded and conquered upper provinces in 1803 and 1804 respectively. But everywhere the system produced devastating results because, as Thomas Munro diagnosed, it was not founded in the usages of the country. 101 Whenever the system failed and the law and order situation deteriorated, the colonial authorities searched for reasons, and the easy scapegoats to be found were the native subordinate officers who were stereotyped for their alleged lack of morality and integrity. So the Cornwallis system was scrapped within a few years. Tahsildars were divested of police duties in 1807, the Daroga system was formally abolished in 1812, and the supervision of the village police was vested in the collector, who was now responsible for revenue, police and magisterial functions at the same time. This extreme concentration of power led to other problems. The subordinates in the revenue department, who were now in charge of revenue collection as well as supervision of rural policing, became the new agents of oppression and coercion. This was revealed, for example, in the report of the Madras Torture Commission appointed in 1854.102 in Bengal. On the other hand, where there was no subordinate establishment in the collectorate offices, because of the permanent settlement, the Darogas were retained and allowed to perform police duties, although after 1817 they were placed under a more regulatory regime closely supervised by the district magistrates. But such patchy reforms were hardly satisfactory and the colonial state clearly needed an appropriate and uniform police system that would assert its authority, secure property and ensure the introduction of its version of the rule of law throughout the empire. The new model was first experimented in Sindh when it was conquered by Sir Charles Napier in 1843. Discarding the previous practice of trying to adapt the indigenous systems to the needs of the colonial state, he created a separate police department with its own officers, following the model of the Royal Irish Constabulary, which he found to be ideally suited to the colonial conditions. It needs to be mentioned here that while English political opinion remained ideologically averse to the idea of a professional police force, it was in Ireland, in view of the growing sectarian and peasant movements, that a regular police force was created in 1787 as an apparatus of colonial intervention. 103 Under this model, which was now applied to Sindh, the whole territory was to be under the supervision of an Inspector General, while the districts would have their own superintendents of police, answerable to both the Inspector General and the District Collector, representing the civilian authority. while the rank and file were to be Indians, the officers were to be invariably Europeans. The Sindh model, which was found to be adequately suited to tackle any political agitation, was later introduced in Punjab when it was conquered in 1849, and later, with various modifications, to Bombay in 1853 and Madras in 1859. The Madras system provided for a military police and a civilian unarmed force, both subservient to the civilian authority of the collector magistrate in the districts. But in the meanwhile, the revolt of 1850 of British rule and had made it more conscious of the need of an effective machinery for collecting information and policing the empire. The Police Commission appointed in 1860 provided for a basic structure of a police establishment for the Indian Empire that was enacted in the Police Act of 1861. And that structure, with only minor adjournments, remained unchanged for the next century of British rule. 104 In the new organization, military police was eliminated and the civilian police was organized on a provincial basis, with the inspector generals answerable to the provincial governments, and the district superintendents to the collector. Thus the entire police organization was placed under the control of the civilian authorities, and for a long time the positions of the inspector general were filled in by civil servants. The district superintendents were to be in charge of rural police, the daroga becoming the sub-inspector, thus solving the age-old problem of integrating rural police into the imperial structure. In this way the police organization established a well-defined hierarchy of command, from which Indians were systematically excluded. The Police Commission of 1902 provided for the appointment of educated Indians to the position of officers in the police force, but they stopped in rank where the European officer began. 10s Thus, distrustful of the Indian subordinates and subservient to the civilian authorities, the Indian police system was tellingly reflective of its colonial nature. Although not a police state in a conventional sense, thinks David Arnold, a police Raj gradually emerged between the revolt of 1857 and the transfer of power in 194. 7.106 Faced with recurrent peasant rebellions and mounting political resistance, the police became the foremost tool of repression in India, with the colonial state retaining total monopoly over its coercive power. And if a situation ever went out of hand, there was always the army to take control. The evolution of the company's army was integrally connected to the development of its Indian Empire. In the 18th century, royal forces, particularly the navy, were often dispatched to India on lease to the company to help it out at times of trouble, but this created problems, particularly in the relationship between the king's army officers and the civilian authorities of the company. So from very early on there was an attempt to raise a permanent company's army in India. The tradition of recruiting peasant armies developing in North India since the 16th century, and this created what Dirk Kolff, 1990, has called a military labor market. During the Mughal period, the distinction between this peasant army and the civilian population was never very dearly marked. It was in the 18th century that the rulers of some of the North Indian successor states, like the Nawab of Awadh and the Raja of Banaras, refined this recruitment system and raised sophisticated trained peasant armies distanced from the civilian communities. 108 It was this tradition that the East India Company appropriated as it started recruiting its own army, which came to be known as the Sepoy, from Sipahi or soldier, army. The French had first initiated this tradition of recruiting an Indian army in 1721-29. And it was against the backdrop of Anglo-French wars in South India that in 1748 Captain, Major Stringer Lawrence, who had brought in the Royal Naval reinforcement to rescue the beleaguered English company, first began the drive towards recruiting a permanent Indian army for the English company. It was renewed by Lord Clive after the defeat of the Bengal Nawab in 1757. This sepoy army was to be trained and disciplined according to European military standards and commanded by European officers in the battlefield. Some of these officers, including the commander-in-chief, were king's officers, while the majority were nominated by the company directors by way of distributing patronage. In the early 19th century, by legislation, 20,000 royal troops were to be stationed in India and paid for by the company, ostensibly as a strategy to subsidize Britain's defense expenditure in the post-Napoleonic era. 109 In addition to that, the size of the company's Indian army also increased continually, and as its territory expanded beyond Bengal, the military labor market from where it recruited extended as well. The number of sepoys rose from 82,000 in 1794 to 154,000 in 1824 to 214,000 in 1856. LLO. Indeed, the recruitment of the East India Company's army, Seema Alavi argues, was central to the development of the company's political sovereignty, 111, which rested on a monopoly of power. The army therefore claimed the largest share of the company's expenditure in India, and also it was crucial to effective collection of revenue, a situation that Douglas Pearce has called military fiscalism. The army not only conquered territories, it also protected the empire against real or imagined internal threats. It handled peasant rebellions against high revenue demands, made alliances with Indian elites, collected information about Indian society and economy. It was thus considered to be the apparatus of rule for the company's administration in India. To a large extent, however, this sense of importance was generated by the army itself. A number of military ideologues argued incessantly that India was in a perpetual state of war, given the militarized state of her society and the inherent volatility of the political situation. This Anglo-Indian militarism, as Pearce argues, created constant pressures for conquests, generated a sense of self-importance for being the ultimate guarantee of the empire's security and stability, and thus sustained its claims to autonomy and unrestrained expenses. 112 The recruitment of the company's army in the 18th century was not just building on the existing traditions of the North Indian military labor market, those traditions were being adapted to British imperial preferences. The recruitment system, for example, endorsed the traditional British preference for peasants as best potential recruits and followed the colonial stereotypes that wheat-eating Indians rather than the rice-eating groups were physically more suitable for the job, although such ethnic stereotyping became a much more important factor in army recruitment in the late 19th century rather than in the 18th. During the initial formative phase, Hastings did not want to disturb the existing caste rules in the affairs of the army. So the company's army consisted mainly of upper caste Brahman and Rajput landed peasants from Awadh and the Rajput and Bhumihar Brahman peasants from North and South Bihar, both wheat-eating regions. These people joined the company's army because the pay, allowances, pension and resettlement provisions offered by the company were much better than those offered by the regional states, and what was most important, salaries were paid regularly. The deliberate policy of respecting caste, dietary, travel and other religious practices of the sepoys fostered a high caste identity of the company's army. By joining it, many of the upcoming socially ambitious castes like the Bhumihar Brahmins could fulfill their aspirations for social mobility. Cornwallis, despite his preference for Anglicization, did not disturb this specific organization of the army, and as a result, the company came to possess a high caste army, which was prone to revolt when their social privileges and pecuniary benefits were cut from the 1820s. As the company's territories expanded to the west beyond the Bengal frontiers into the mountainous jungle terai, in the 1770s and then into the ceded and conquered districts in 1802, there was another attempt to recruit from among the hill tribes. While in the plains the company ran permanent recruitment centers, in the hills recruitment was made through local notables and payment was offered through the Mughal system. of Gatwali service tenures. The defeat of the Indian states, particularly of Mysore in the late 18th and of the Marathas in the early 19th centuries, created another vast reservoir of surplus armed manpower to recruit from, but the company's army could not absorb all the disbanded soldiers of the Indian princes. Then from 1815 there was another experiment to recruit Gorkha soldiers from among the Nepalis, Garhwalis and Simari hillmen. A skillful blending of the Nepali martial tradition and European training and discipline made the Gorkhas the most trusted soldiers in the British army. Thus, as the empire expanded, the company's army came to incorporate a variety of social groups and a number of military traditions, which had to be accommodated in a careful balancing game, and power had to be shared with the local elites. Within these circumstances, while the Bengal army remained more high caste in character, the Bombay and Madras armies became more heterogeneous. In the 1820s, when the empire attained stability with the weakening of most of the Indian powers, and company's finances ran into trouble, the contradictions of this balancing game became apparent. In the following decade there were attempts to streamline the army administration, the main purpose of which was to have more rigorous control over the sepoys and their families. The reforms of the 1830s, which aimed at leveling the differences and promoting a universal military culture, as Alave shows, created discontent among the sepoys. This unhappy feeling particularly showed in the Bengal army, as the reforms infringed upon the sepoys' high caste status and disturbed the power relations within which they were located. In the 1840s, therefore, the disaffection of Indian troops found articulate expressions from time to time, and these incidents prepared the backdrop for the mutiny in the Bengal army in 1857, which shall be discussed in the next chapter. After the mutiny there was a lot of rethinking about the constitution and recruitment strategies for the Indian army. The Peel Commission, which was appointed to look into the military affairs of India, recommended that the native army should be composed of different nationalities and castes, and as a general rule, mixed promiscuously through each regiment. 114 therefore, during the next few years regiments which had mutinied were disbanded, castes were more evenly mixed across the regiments, recruitment remained focused on Punjab, which remained loyal during the mutiny, and the regional elements like the Punjab, Hindustan, Bombay and Madras were carefully kept separate. The recruitment strategies were streamlined in the 1880s when the colonial knowledge of Indian ethnicity and racial stereotypes were deployed to evolve the theory of martial races. Certain groups, such as the Pathans of the northwest frontier province, the Jars of Punjab, the Rajputs of North India or the Gorkhas of Nepal, were identified as ideally suited for the job, because of their martial background or racial status, i.e., being of Aryan Kshatriya stock. These groups were thought to be warlike, trustworthy, but at the same time intellectually deficient, so that they could fight but not lead. This gave the European commanding officers a sense of security. As David O'Missey calculates, by 1914, about three-quarters of the Indian infantry came from Punjab, Nepal or the northwest frontier province. 11s The peasants from these social groups joined the army primarily because it was a lucrative career. On the other hand, their loyalty was ensured by the army administration by deliberately encouraging their respective religious traditions and their sense of honor, which kept them devoted to the master whose salt they had eaten. The valorizing of warrior self-image communicated through uniforms and other insignia, and the idea of shamming themselves and their communities through dishonorable deeds or cowardice remained important parts of a carefully cultivated army culture. This loyalty of the army was important for the stability of the Raj, as it was used more against internal threats to security than against external foes. Except for a brief Russian threat through Afghanistan in the 1880s, the British Empire in India did not face any external danger to its security. Yet a large army was maintained, 250,000 in peacetime, devouring 40% of the central revenue. The British Raj, writes David O'Missey, was a garrison state, .116 in the administration of this garrison state the relationship between the civilian and military authorities remained always a sticky point ever since the beginning of the company's army. In order to establish civilian authority over the army, the Charter Act of 1793 very clearly gave the ultimate control over all matters of war and peace to the Board of Control. The Commander-in-Chief was made subservient to the Governor-General, but the functional relationship between the two, despite various safeguards, worked well only when there was good personal understanding between them. Often the pressure of the army was too much for the civilian authorities to withstand. Lord Amherst was pressurized by the army into a belligerent foreign policy, while William Bentinck had serious problems in his dealings with his Commander-in-Chief 117. This relationship continued to be unpleasant during the period of Crown rule. During the notorious Curzon-Kitchener controversy in May 1904, the Commander-in-Chief, Lord Kitchener, wanted to abolish the position of the military member in the Viceroy's Council and centralize control and command of the army in his own hands. Viceroy Lord Curzon objected to it, and when the Home Government offered a compromise formula of reducing the powers of the military member without abolishing the position, he offered his resignation. To his surprise, the resignation was quickly accepted, indicating the power of the army establishment. But Kitchener too did not have his way fully. In 1905 the position of the military member was abolished and the Commander-in-Chief became directly responsible to the Viceroy's Council. But the crucial financial control of the army was not left in his hands. For this a separate military finance department was created, with a civilian chain of command going up to the finance member of the council. This system remained in place until the end of colonial rule. 11 times in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the army remained, as before, the most effective instrument of coercion. It provided guarantee of stability to the Raj against all sorts of civil disturbances, for example, nationalist agitations, workers' strikes, peasant movements or communal riots. The police were not always suitable to handle these situations, as the policemen lived in the communities and therefore were susceptible to social coercion and exposed to ideological influences. The army, on the other hand, was quarantined in the garrisons spread across India, deliberately kept at a low level of literacy and insulated from all political influences. The army was not used frequently for the purpose of policing the country, as frequent use would reduce its effectiveness and blunt its demonstration impact. But the civilian administrators knew that it was always there at times of grave emergencies. In such situations, and there were more of them in the 1920s and 1930s, usually British troops were preferred, as since 1857 till almost the end of the colonial period one British soldier was maintained to 2 or 3 Indian sepoys. But in a vast country like India, colonial order could not be maintained without the collaboration of the latter, who remained steadfast in their loyalty to the King Emperor. Except on 2 occasions, one in 1907 during the Canal Colony agitations in Punjab and then again in 1920 during the Sikh Gurudwara movement, the sepoys were never touched by the political agitations. This was the main reason why there was so much bureaucratic opposition to the Indianisation of the command chain in the army. Training and appointment of Indian officers started hesitatingly. In 1931 after the first Round Table Conference. The issue was given full consideration only in the 1940s as a delayed concession to the nationalists under the pressure of the military needs of World War II. But it was already too late to win the sympathies of the Indians. In the subsequent years the composition of the Army Officer Corps completely changed and many of the Indian officers became attracted to the cause of Indian nationalism. 11 times visible signs of this cracking of the loyalty of the Indian Army, we will argue in the last chapter, was one of the main reasons why the Raj had to end its career in 194-7. Indian Civil Service, the Civilian Bureaucracy, which controlled the army by pulling the financial strings if not anything else and ran the Indian Empire with its help, were meant only to implement policies framed at home. But the distance between London and India, the difficulties of communication and their command over information from the field gave them a considerable amount of discretion and initiative. As a result, as Clive Dewey observes, in their heyday they were the most powerful officials in the empire, if not the world. 120 It was a patronage bureaucracy, at the outset, as the method of recruitment, as outlined by the India Act of 1784 and the Charter Act of 1793, was only through nomination by the members of the Court of Directors of the company, who would sign a declaration that they had not received any money for offering this favor. Various factors also compelled them to nominate from outside their immediate family circles. Yet, corruption and inefficiency gradually crept in, and the educational background as well as abilities of the recruits were found to be extremely uneven. As Bernard Cohn calculated, between 1840 and 1860, 50 to 60 extended families contributed the vast majority of civil servants who governed India. 121 And from this service, Indians were carefully excluded, as no position worth an annual salary of £500 or more could be held by them. The expansion of empire, however, increased the responsibilities of governance and required an efficient bureaucracy, trained in Indian languages and laws. Lord Wellesley, who arrived in India in 1798 with a grand imperial vision, wrote in his Minute of 1800 that the Indian Empire should not be administered as a temporary and precarious acquisition. 122 What he wanted was adequate training for the European civil servants. At Fort William College in Calcutta, the civil servants from all the presidencies took 3 years training before getting their civil posting. But the college did not continue for long, as Wellesley soon lost the favor of the Court of Directors, and the latter feared that such a training program might result in the loyalties of the civil servants shifting from London to Calcutta. So in 1802 Fort William College was closed. It would continue there only as a language school. In its place, in 1805 the East India College was established at Hertford near London. It was moved to Highbury in 1809. AJL candidates nominated by the Court of Directors were to have at this college 2 years of training, and only if they passed the final examination would they secure an appointment to civil service in India. It is difficult to fathom how much influence this education actually had on the subsequent behavior of the civil servants in India, as this training, following Lord Macaulay's recommendation, was essentially based on a generalist curriculum, which, except the language component, had practically nothing of relevance to India. But Highbury College developed among the Indian civil servants a sense of camaraderie, or indeed a sense of belonging to an exclusive club. By the 1830s, however, the administrative responsibilities of the bureaucracy in India had increased immensely, as the district collector had once again combined in his office the revenue collecting responsibilities, magisterial authority and also some judicial powers. In the newly conquered territories, the so-called non-regulation provinces such as Punjab or Assam, the powers and responsibilities of the district officers were even greater. Along with that, functions of the state were also gradually extending to newer areas of activities. This brought in greater impersonalization and a more elaborate hierarchy in the bureaucratic structure, requiring more able administrators. It was, therefore, felt around this time that the existing patronage system could not bring in adequate number of able personnel for such onerous administrative responsibilities. What was needed was competition to attract the best minds from the rising middle classes of England. The Charter Act of 1833 introduced competition for recruitment, but it was limited competition among the candidates nominated by the directors and therefore could not improve the situation. Finally, the Charter Act of 1853 introduced the principle of open competition, Civil servants for India were henceforth to be recruited through an examination open to all, natural-born subject of Her Majesty. The High Library College was abolished in 185-8 and the Civil Service Commission henceforth recruited civil servants through an examination held annually in England. The steel frame of a centralized bureaucracy thus came of age in India in response to the needs of an empire that had by now established itself on firm grounds. It was no wonder, therefore, that in this administrative structure the Indians were accommodated, if at all, only in subordinate positions, known as the uncovenanted civil service. After 1813 under Warren Hastings a gradual process of Indianization of the subordinate services had begun, mainly in the judiciary. Later Lord Bentinck advocated inclusion of Indians for orientating administration to local needs. The other reason might have been the question of expenses. A regulation in 1831 gave more power and responsibility to the Indian judicial officers, but the top echelon of the covenanted civil service still remained close to the Indians. The introduction of competitive examination in 1853 technically opened the gates to the Indians, but they were still effectively barred, as the recruitment examination was held only in England. And in spite of repeated petitions from the Indian nationalists in the late 19th century, the opposition of the European bureaucracy prevented the holding of a simultaneous examination in India. Yet the government could neither ignore the nationalist demands, and so the compromise formula was the introduction in 1870 of a statutory civil service. It meant that Indians of ability and merit could be nominated to a few positions hitherto reserved for the European covenanted civil servants. But as Lord Lytton's predilections were clearly in favour of the aristocracy, Indians chosen for such positions were usually those with respectable family background or belonging to the indigenous princely families. It was Lord Ripon who realized the political importance of the Indian middle classes and argued that their continued exclusion from administration might eventually spell danger for the empire. He, therefore, preferred a simultaneous competitive examination in India, which would allow the entry of educated Indians of merit and ability into the covenanted civil service. But the proposal met with the concerted opposition of the European bureaucracy, who clearly felt threatened by the prospect of sharing power with the Indians. Indeed, in the late 19th century following the revolt of 1857, the European covenanted civil servants in India suffered from a profound sense of insecurity, which issued from aristocratic criticism at home, liberal democratic attacks in the parliament and the growing political protests of the educated Indians. They loathed therefore any idea of sharing power with the Indians and tried to scuttle the Local Self-Government Act in 1882 and then in resist conjunction with the Anglo-Indian and often even overtly, the Ilbert Bill in 1883-84. They objected the very idea of introducing the principle of election in India and obstructed the proposed Indianization of the civil service on the basis of a mythical rationale of inefficiency that was used to legitimize their own monopoly of power. 121 The structure of the civil service was ultimately reformed in 1892, on the basis of the recommendations of our Public Service Commission submitted 5 years ago. The new regulations retained the exclusive status of the covenanted civil service and called it the Indian Civil Service, ICS. The uncovenanted civil service, on the other hand, was to shed its derogatory epithet and was to be called the Provincial Civil Service. The statutory civil service was abolished, and in its place certain higher positions which were previously preserved for the ICS were now to be filled in through promotion from the Provincial Civil Service. The Indians could still enter the ICS through the open examination held in London, but their representation in this service remained abysmally low, just about 15% in 1922. But then it was from this year that the proportion of representation in the civil service began to change. In response to the nationalist demands, the Government of India Act of 1919 finally provided for a separate, not simultaneous, recruitment examination to the ICS to be held in India, and under its provision, the first examination was held in Allahabad in February 1922. As a result, by 1941 the Indians outnumbered the Europeans in this charmed circle of Indian civil service. If the period between 1858 and 1919 was that of bureaucratic despotism T.P., when the will of the civil servants used to run the government, this tendency somewhat diminished after the gradual democratization of the polity since 1919. But even after 1937, when Indian ministers took office in the provinces, the administration was virtually run by the civil servants, because of their superior knowledge at the ground level and their informal alliances with the local power structure. However, the gradual Lundianization of the civil service also reduced its value as an apparatus of authoritarian rule for the empire and paved the way for a transfer of power. On the other hand, this Indianization made it possible for the continuation of the tradition into the period after independence, 125, when the service only changed its nomenclature into the Indian Administrative Service.